Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to our seminar series event for today. I'm the Director of Insight Clinical Support Services here, and we'd like to welcome you in the audience, in webinar land and on teleconference. Apologies to our webinar guests last week. We had a major internet fail which affected our building. It wasn't our system, it was an internet connection to the building which caused our internet to drop out. So we've got a backup system in place today for the webinar, so hopefully our guests online will have a smoother experience with us today, and we'll be getting the film recording of our webinar with Joyce McSwan last week up very soon, and we'll email that out to everyone so you can watch it from the luxury of your own PCs. We won't have any technical issues today as we explore a fascinating topic of global research and trends in AOD with our very own special guest, Mr. Jeremy Hayllar. So please welcome Jeremy to talk about globalisation. Thank you.
Thanks very much. So every year we have to think of a catchy title. It gives me a great opportunity to sort of try and focus on current literature. So that's what I've done today. And this is the topic, or these are the topics we'll be covering in alphabetical order, I think. So I was really intrigued by this battle going on the pages of The Lancet and other journals. So here we have Wayne Hall, Adrian Carter, so they're Queensland academics. The brain disease model of addiction. Is it supported by the evidence and has it delivered on its promises? The clear implication of those questions is no and no. And then we have Nora Volkow, who is director of NIDA and granddaughter of Count Leo Tolstoy, I discovered recently. The brain disease model of addiction, why is it so controversial? And so these two have written here and in other places at significant length about their concepts of addiction. And I think it's helpful for us to reflect a little bit on that. NIDA brought in this idea of a brain disease in the 90s. One of the points made by Wayne Hall and Adrian Carter is there's an element of choice, of control in this so-called disease. If you have a patient with Alzheimer's, can you really suggest that their decision-making process, their intellectual decay is subject to their choice, to their own volition? We're really dealing with different processes here, and to suggest there's a binary between brain disease and not brain disease is trying to reduce things absurdly, really, reductio ad absurdum. Perhaps it fits with the US model of abstinence. You know, you want a clean result, you want no drugs on board at all. And if so, how do people with a brain disease get themselves better? Because many do. We know 2/3 of those who quit smoking, which is a highly dependence-forming habit with nicotine, the agent, 2/3 of those people will stop by themselves. They would be, under NIDA's definition, suffering from a brain disease. How do they get themselves better? We have drug courts where people are subjected to rewards and punishments and encouragement and recognition for good behaviors. How does that fit in with the model of a brain disease? It doesn't. Reducing things to a single disease model is not really satisfactory. We have to look at this as multiple level problem. Brain pathways, genetics, psychology, social, indeed that biopsychosocial pattern that we try and explore when we're doing an assessment. If this is simply a brain disease, then our brains have been hijacked and we're more or less helpless. What sort of message does that send to people about their condition and things they can do to improve it? Now, this is another paper from The Lancet. Again, Wayne Hall, Jason Connor and Paul Haber, so a full Australian product. Alcohol use disorders, and I commend it to you. I think it's a very good review. They highlight that alcohol is alcohol use disorder is perhaps one of the commonest, or the commonest, and most untreated mental health disorder in the developed world. Only about 15% of people with the definition receive treatment. Very high numbers in the US applying DSM-5 meet criteria for alcohol use disorder in their lives. Over a third of males and over a fifth of females. Alcohol consumption is now linked to at least 60 diseases. And half of those with a lifetime alcohol use disorder have another mental health disorder. So that's our dual diagnosis idea featuring large. The 4% of the global burden of disease, GBD, is caused by alcohol. Interestingly, how an alcohol unit is defined varies quite broadly from the UK, the most miserly, 8 grams, to the Japanese, a generous 19.75 grams. And the US, I think it's half an ounce, which is about 13 to 14 grams. 50% of alcohol-related harm comes in people with alcohol use disorder. And 50% of those have significant liver disease. So there's lots of interventions that help, psychological. They were less enthusiastic about 12-step facilitation, so AA. The really successful treatments, cognitive therapy, motivational enhancement. Talked about withdrawal management, so diazepam is accepted there as the benchmark. Thiamine, IM or IV, 200 milligrams a day, much higher doses in established Wernicke's. So this is something which comes up again and again, and I think this is a useful reference to highlight the idea of high doses given TDS over a significant period. So 2 to 3 days, maybe longer, if your patient hasn't improved. What about response to treatment? Controls, as much as 20%, 21% abstinence. Those on treatment, 25 to 43% abstinence. So perhaps in good hands, doubling the rates of abstinence that we can expect. We talk about matching patients to treatment modalities. Trouble is we don't know how, and Project Match confirmed that, and no one really seems to have developed better ideas since. As well as the use of acamprosate and naltrexone, they point to some evidence for topiramate, gabapentin, baclofen, and varenicline. Now, a grumbling dispute in alcohol circles is whether low rates of consumption have a protective effect on health. And this has been like a Wimbledon tennis final, the ball going either side of the net many, many times. So here is a meta-analysis which comes from, again, some Australians and some others. Tim Stockwell, I think, yes, he's in BC, in Canada. So 4 million people, 367,000 deaths in the meta-analysis of 87 studies. And what they showed was that if you don't adjust for risk factors, you can show evidence to suggest that low rates of consumption do provide protection. However, if you take out what's called abstainer bias, recognizing that a significant number of those who have stopped drinking completely will have done so because of alcohol-related health issues, then you eliminate that supposed difference completely, so it's no longer a significant difference. So they conclude from this study that a low level of alcohol consumption has no net mortality benefit compared with a lifetime abstinence or occasional drinking. And when doing this sort of review, former drinkers should be combined with current drinkers when comparing drinking groups, because there is that significant proportion that sway the data. Just to show here, and I know it's a lot of numbers, if you don't control for all the variables, then you appear to have a significant difference between former drinkers, occasional and low volume drinkers. However, once you adjust for all the identified covariates, then those differences disappear. You still see a trend for higher volume consumption leading to adverse health outcomes. And that's more the sort of trend we would expect. It also recognizes that former drinkers carry roughly the same risk as heavy drinkers. In other words, they've stopped because of a likely health problem related to their drinking. Just expressed as a forest plot, without removing the covariates, these lower relative risk of death, but as you adjust the data to better reflect the other risk factors involved, that apparent health benefit disappears completely. Now, what about injuries? We're clear about the relationship between alcohol and injuries. So this is a study of 37 emergency departments, 14,000 patients, and they went around the world, including South America and so forth. So from their data, 1 in 6 of all injuries coming to an emergency department are alcohol related. And there was recently a survey of emergency departments in Australia and New Zealand on Australia Day, which came up with a similar figure. They just did a census of people in the department and worked out what proportion of those attendees were there because of an alcohol problem. Males, 1 in 5, almost 1 in 2 assaults are related to alcohol, prior alcohol consumption. So WHO has an idea of detrimental drinking pattern in particular countries. When you look at that across the globe, you find that those countries with a detrimental drinking pattern, that predicts half of the difference in the rate of alcohol-related injuries. So this isn't about individuals. This is also, to a large extent, about how society is set up to facilitate or to restrict alcohol ingestion, and how society responds to those who are intoxicated. Once again, we can see the relative risk going up from those with less than 2 drinks, 2.5, 2 to 4 drinks, 4.6, 4 to 6 drinks, 6, 8, 9, 11, and then 15 to 30 drinks, 13 times the relative risk. So a very coherent data set. Injury related to the level of consumption. Older, wiser lifestyles. So when we all get old, we're going to be owls, hopefully. Preventing and reducing alcohol and other drug-related harm in older people. So this came out about 3 months ago, I think. And there's no Queensland represented, but it's certainly an Australian document. It won't surprise you to learn that alcohol is the most commonly used drug, and it causes most of the alcohol and drug-related problems and harms in older people. What we can see between 2001 and 2013 is a significant increase, 31% in short-term risky drinkers and 20% increase in lifetime risky drinkers, going to 18.6 of those 60 to 69-year-olds. It may not surprise you to learn that the group in society which is most likely to drink every day is those 70 and over, where 15% are likely to be drinking every day. Contrast that with 14 to 24, 1%, and 25 to 39, just 4%. So you can see that very pale blue bar gets bigger and bigger as we get older. Turning from alcohol to illicits. This is over the last 5 household surveys, looking at different age groups. So 2013 is in the maroon, and what we can see is that in the 50 to 59-year-olds and the 60-year-olds, we've seen significant increases in illicit drug use, whereas in other age groups, 14 to 19, 20 to 29, 30 to 39, the trend, if anything, is coming downwards. So people talk about this, the boom getting into old age. Perhaps they're no longer responsible at work, they've retired, and they're recreating with both alcohol and illicit drugs more commonly than used to be the case. Now, this study said they were the first group to actually go to drinkers and ask them what they thought about guidelines. And I don't know how often you raise the issue of alcohol guidelines with your patients, but sometimes they're very surprised, and sometimes they know the answers. Most often, though, people are not really aware. So they tried to analyse this a bit more closely, and they found this major disconnect between the guidelines, which assume a level of regular drinking, and the sort of binging or irregular pattern of use in their 66 informants. People didn't really grasp the concept of a unit. They may have known how many drinks they consumed, but they didn't know how many units were in each drink. They had quite a lot of difficulty monitoring the number of units. And many said that since they didn't really drink in the week, they didn't need to count what they did on the weekend, because most of the time they were being good, which shows the way people think, I suppose. And many said they actually preferred the Australian guidelines, even though the number of drinks you're allowed on one occasion is only four. And I remember reading, I think it was John Saunders saying, it's crazy, no, Australian males going to restrict themselves to 4 drinks in one drinking session. Nevertheless, in the UK, that was preferred because it kind of gave you an alternative. Either you could follow the daily ceiling on safe consumption, or you could splurge out and have 4. Of course, though, most of those 66 were just there to get as drunk as possible and weren't really concerned about the health effects. So guidelines perhaps weren't going to have the effect that we might have hoped. This is a review of the alcohol industry. We know that the tobacco industry is a sort of no-go area. They're egregious, they mislead, they peddle death. I don't know that the alcohol industry is much better. Unlike the tobacco industry, though, alcohol is still represented at the table with WHO when they're making policy and in their alcohol committees. The industry has many ways of trying to avoid scrutiny. Regulatory redundancy. We're a self-policing industry. We act responsibly. We're not going to just be after sales. We want people to drink responsibly. So we don't need more regulation. Legal, the rights of consumers. It's a consumer's right to go and get as much alcohol and be as drunk as they want. That's not our problem. We're advertising simply to get brand preference happening. Negative consequences. Well, it will have a very negative impact on employment. Think of the Fortitude Valley nighttime precinct. If we restrict sales of alcohol, then you're going to have lots of people unemployed. We'll have a huge successful industry on its knees, not to mention all those working in the alcohol industry itself. Very complex area, very hard to say that one intervention will produce any results. So let's just leave things to go along as they are, they're fine. There isn't really enough evidence to show that sales lead to harms, they would suggest. Now, of course, the tobacco company used very similar arguments about the link between cancer and their products. Those arguments, of course, were wrong. So I think we need to have clear perspective when we're reading this sort of material and recognize the tricks and the tools that the industry used to try and justify their behaviors. Exercise training, a beneficial intervention in the treatment of alcohol use disorders. So if you equip mice in a cage with a running wheel, they do much less binging on alcohol. Now, clearly, we're not mice. However, we know that those people who have an anxiety disorder have 2 to 3 times the risk of an alcohol use disorder. And likewise, at least 1/3 of people who have an alcohol use disorder complain of anxiety. We know that withdrawal from alcohol may trigger anxiety or panic attacks. We know that exercise has benefits for anxiety, panic attacks, PTSD. It reduces impulsivity. It's an evidence-based treatment of depression, and 1/3 of those with alcohol use disorder have depression. And it boosts self-efficacy. Therefore, perhaps exercise could be sold as a hedonic substitute, which is rather a long word for something that gives you pleasure. So in theory, then, it's an excellent rationale for using exercise as a treatment, not just for alcohol use disorders, but other substance use disorders. Although we don't have any quality studies to reinforce that, I try and build it into consults to make sure people are doing enough. The opioid people is another group that comes to mind. If they can start building their own endorphin production, if indeed it is endorphins, then perhaps there's going to be less reliance on other material. Now, this is a very Australian product. We can see Sharon Dorr, David Kavanagh, Ross Young, John Saunders. the profile of psychiatric symptoms exacerbated by methamphetamine use. This is probably too small to read. What it's really showing is that it's the positive symptoms which methamphetamine duplicates, rather than the disorientation, conceptual disorganization, blunted affect. It's the unusual thoughts, the hallucinations, the suspiciousness. So that's really fairly self-evident, I think. That's what we would expect someone with amphetamine toxicity to complain of. But it maybe perhaps helps us differentiate between those with an existing psychiatric disorder and those with a drug-induced psychiatric disorder. Although I guess the true test will be how it evolves over time, and initially at least our treatment may be very similar or the same. Novel psychoactive substance use among regular psychostimulant users in Australia, 2010 to 2015. Now this is again too small to see, but we're talking about methadone, phenylethylamines, tryptamines, synthetic cannabinoids, piperazines, plants and extracts. And what's striking is that although in 2010 levels of use are generally higher in 6.8% of psychostimulant users had used synthetics, so Spice, K2, Chronic and others. In 2011, that went up to 16 and then came down quite quickly. So it shows the dynamic nature of markets and what people choose to use. And indeed, some of the other substances have sort of risen a bit and then fallen off completely. So although the overall consumption, 40.2%, is up on 2010, the trends in the last year are generally down. Perhaps people recognizing, for example, synthetic cannabinoids are probably much more of a risk than a benefit in terms of experience. Now, there's been quite a lot of publications in recent years about benzo use, and I haven't tried to summarize them all. Kripke in 2012 published in the BMJ showing really worrying problems with benzo use over time. This is another study from North America, this is time set in Seattle, with those over 65, over 3,000 participants, and they looked at their treatment over the previous 10 years. And then over a mean of 7 years follow-up, nearly 800 of this group were diagnosed with dementia. And they related that to the prescribing of benzodiazepines. And as you can see, 1 to 30 of the standard daily doses seem to give a harm risk of 1.25, hazard ratio, 31 to 120, a little bit higher. But then more than 120 standard daily doses, the risks seem to come off. So their findings do not suggest a link with dementia. So clearly there's more work needed in this field. We've had studies from France and the US showing harms from benzos. This is another study to kind of balance that a wee bit. Nevertheless, the editorials are clear. Benzo treatment is recommended at most for a few days or weeks in selected patients with transient insomnia. However, benzos are used mainly in older people, women more than men, for long periods with recognized risks of falls, motor vehicle crashes, and memory loss. Do we still need them at all? We've seen how they're a kind of a double whammy for treating anxiety. They work so well that people are going to be very unhappy not to continue them, and we're more conscious of the long-term risks of using them. So should they be confined to psychiatrists? Should they be phased out almost completely, as has been done with barbiturates? These are questions that the editorial doesn't answer. Now, this is about programmable bio-nanochip systems using oral fluids in the context of drug driving, which is a growing issue. And so they've developed a system which uses mouth swabs and therefore oral fluids, and they've got a portable immunochromatography system which measures cannabis, morphine, amphetamine, methamphetamine, cocaine, methadone, benzos, a range of benzos indeed. The results come within 10 minutes And they are not just qualitative, but quantitative, giving you levels down to nanogram levels, which is highly sensitive. So they're giving us really a quantitative result, which is somewhat analogous now to the breathalyzer. And as you know, we've got 0.05 as the level above which you're committing an offence if you're driving in Australia. Whether this is going to evolve into a similar approach for illicit substances, I rather doubt. Nevertheless, more information perhaps is going to be useful. At the moment, if you come up with a positive test on your immunoassay in a drug driving scenario, then that's automatically an offence, whether you're affected by the substance at the time you were driving or not. Now, this study, I hope everyone has heard about it. Case and Deaton came out as a total shock. So what we can see on the left is a graph showing deaths per 100,000 in midlife across a range of countries. So France, Germany, US, Hispanics, UK, Canada, Australia, Sweden, US whites. So what's happened is the death rate amongst middle-aged US white males has been rising over the past 10, 15 years or so. Then we look at causation, and although one thinks of chronic disease as maybe playing its part, deaths from diabetes don't seem particularly to have risen in line with the obesity epidemic. What has risen, though, is poisonings, suicides, and chronic liver disease. At the same time, lung cancer has fallen off, reflecting that century, the 20th century, which had the epidemic of smoking in males. Women have got a 30-year lag before they catch up and their cancer rates start falling. So the mortality gap for whites spanned all working age years, but was most severe at middle age. So what we've got here is in grey, we've got what would be predicted. Because of improvements in treatments and public health generally, we do expect an increase in life expectancy gradually occurring. So I read recently the life expectancy between 2000 and 2015 has increased by 5 years. What's not happened in the States for this middle-aged group of whites is not only have they failed to improve their life expectancy, they've actually had an increase in the likelihood of death, so a loss of life expectancy, which covers the group from 21 right up until the age of 60 or 63, where you can see, and in particular the length of the orange line indicates the discrepancy between what would be predicted and what's actually been seen. So in this lower age group, it seems largely explained by overdoses, and in the higher age group, it's those three things: chronic liver disease, and trialing injection drug use in the 60s and 70s with 30 or 40-year lead time. So chronic liver disease, suicides, and overdoses. And this is just put in a slightly different way. We can see how heart disease has fallen dramatically, but poisoning, suicide, and chronic liver disease and cirrhosis have all risen between 1999 and 2014. Other causes here have also risen. So it's a dramatic finding, which was revealed by looking closely at the statistics, because these data were really hidden. So it took these two Princeton economists to dig it up, and it got very widely publicized, New York Times and the rest. And it has to be said that in the New York Times yesterday, there was talk about, at last, a fall, in prescribing of opioids over the last 3 years. So rates of prescribing have stalled and have started falling off, and in turn, falling in numbers of opioid deaths. So there's been a very major response. Obama's put, I think, more than $1 billion at trying to address this epidemic, and perhaps slowly results are being seen. Now, we know that coming out of prison is a very dangerous time for those with opioid dependence. This was a retrospective chart review with a nested case control. So they found the patients or the people who'd overdosed and died, and they tried to match them with age, gender, prisoners who'd been released. And they wanted to find what the key risk factors seemed to be for death. So tobacco use disorder, panic disorder, cirrhosis, those on psych meds, those on opioids, as well as homelessness, injection drug use, and tobacco use disorder. So the whole biopsychosocial history kind of catching up with individuals once they're released from prison. What was interesting was those who had prison treatment while they were inside, which is often a fairly imperfect intervention, because people may feel they're not free to disclose their use, and maybe the environment is not entirely conducive. They had a 1/3 reduction in the risk of death compared with the controls. And this is without going into opioid treatment or being given take-home naloxone, which is increasingly happening in the prison setting, certainly in the UK and more in the US. We should not lose sight of, at the same time, in wealthy countries, a surplus and abundance of opioids. 80% of the world's population actually lack opioids for their recognized indicated uses, for example, in palliative care. So there was very recently a Lancet editorial about this to accompany a long article looking at the distribution of opioid availability around the world. Open label dose finding trial. Now this trial is from 2009, so it's not really this that I'm reporting. Note Maria McCosker is one of the authors. So this was probufene, a buprenorphine implant, which is now licensed in the US. Titan is the sort of dynamic name of the company. Just looking back at this paper, the implants are 1 inch long, so 26 millimeters. Each contains 80 milligrams of buprenorphine, and to give 6 months cover, 4 implants are inserted at one time, generally in the non-dominant arm beside the biceps. And it seems that the doctor doing the insertion requires a day's training. It's done under local without a suture, but when you remove the implants at 6 months, you do need to place a suture. At the same time, we've got Indivior that makes Suboxone. They are developing a depot product which will be administered each month. We don't know the dosing yet. There is a study which we're advised is nearing completion, and results should be available for March next year at the International Medicine and Addiction meeting, which is in Sydney. So it'll be interesting to see how these two measure up. A monthly depot, which will be a simple needle injection, as against a 6-monthly implant, whether that will become available in Australia and what the implications will be. One of the challenges for the Indivior product is the cold chain. Although it'll have 5 days stability at room temperature, the rest will have to be kept refrigerated. So how exactly is it going to be administered? Will this be something done in clinics? Will pharmacies be doing the dosing? We don't really know, and it's an interesting area. Again, about prison releases, this is an Australian study. There you can see Louisa Degenhardt and many others. A cost-effectiveness analysis of opioid substitution therapy upon prison release in reducing mortality in people with a history of opioid dependence. So they did one of these big data burns, and this is a plot to show that opioid treatment after release is less costly and saves more lives. So going this way, we have the decrease in mortality, and this way, the saving in cost. They had about 16,000 prison releases that they were able to look at over 15 years or so, and they looked at the costs in the first 6 months. Half were opioid treated, and the other half were controls. So they had half the deaths in those in opioid treatment, and the cost was roughly half as well. So pretty persuasive arguments. And this is the sort of data we need to persuade politicians that investing in this unpopular, marginal, and difficult area actually saves money, and therefore there'll be more left over to manage other areas. Now, I'd had the belief that in the States there was an increasing problem with heroin, largely from people on prescription opioids who were running out of private health funds and found it cheaper to buy heroin. So I was rather surprised to see this paper in a very recent New England journal, which really put another view. Certainly heroin has got a lot cheaper. So in the 90s it was $2,000 to $2,500 a gram in the US. It's now well under $600, which is a bit more than I expected, and I think it's certainly cheaper than that in Europe. What they've suggested is that although many heroin users have used non-medical prescription opioids in their past, only about 3% of those on prescription opioids have moved to heroin. Now, the reason this is relevant is because one of the fears was by making modified release and other adjustments to opioids for long-acting effect, one of the unintended consequences might be that people were switching to heroin instead because that's quick-acting and easy to find and easy to inject. That doesn't seem to be the case. So the 3% of prescription opioid users who were moving to heroin seem to have been doing that before there were successive introductions of different modified release preparations, such as OxyContin MR. So the switch came before that, or it was happening already before that. So what we can see in these two graphs, the number of overdose deaths per 10,000 of population. So 2014, this still looks like it's going up, doesn't it, from prescription opioids, and certainly the heroin deaths are going up, though you'll notice these are still quite significantly lower than the opioid deaths. In this graph, we've got non-medical use of prescription opioids and heroin during the previous year, and we can see prescription opioids are really bouncing along, and they have certainly started coming down since 2011. Heroin use has gone up somewhat, but this is still about only 10% of the proportion using prescription opioids. So the heroin users are still a fairly small group in terms of those using, but they're obviously grossly overrepresented in terms of those who are dying from an overdose. This is a study from Ireland, and they looked at their methadone program over those 6 years, almost 7,000 individuals. At least half of those patients had 5 or more treatment episodes. So this idea of cycling in and out of treatment, which it's discussed whether that gives you benefits from treatment or not, because typically when you leave a treatment program, you're at high risk of overdose. And during the first 2 weeks, typically when you join a treatment program, you're at increased risk of overdose. They were able to show that ongoing methadone treatment reduces the risk of death. Nearly 2/3 of their doses were between 60 and 120 milligrams, so they were getting effective treatment doses. Rather worryingly, perhaps, there was a lot of co-prescribing, so more than 2/3 on benzos, a quarter on antipsychotics, a half on antidepressants. Surprisingly, they showed there was no clear benefit from supervised doses, which we kind of regard as a cornerstone of our treatment program in Australia. And they also didn't have a mortality spike on induction. Now that is a real surprise, isn't it? Particularly when you consider this is being opioid treatment in primary care. So I don't really know how they've managed to do that, whether the induction guidelines are very strict, whether there is widespread adherence to those guidelines. Mindful, of course, that if you induct someone too slowly on methadone, then they carry on using, so you've got that combined risk, whereas if you induct them too quickly, you can overdose them. And typically, Australian data shows there is a mortality spike during those first 2 weeks of induction, although perhaps it's becoming less pronounced as guidelines are kind of increasingly respected. So we're no longer doing it off the back of an envelope as maybe in the 90s and early 2000s. We're really much more adherent to guidelines than we were. Now we know that people on opioids have a risk of depression. This shows that if they've had a history of depression, then they're at 2 times the risk of a return, a relapse in depression if they go on to opioids. So it's another little chink in the armor to help people stay away from opioids if they possibly can. Now we're reaching tobacco. This was a study from London and the US. Robert West is editor of Addiction and others. And this is just a little detail around quitting. So they looked at a study of people doing gradual and abrupt smoking cessation. Until this study, Cochrane suggested there was really no difference in success rates long term. This study of 700 patients, which is a fair number, showed there was greater sustained quitting from abrupt compared with gradual cessation. So at 6 months, those quitting abruptly had a 22% success rate against the 15.6% success rate with the gradual quitters. And perhaps it's saying something about gradual quitters being a little more equivocal. Certainly a lot of patients tell me, yeah, they're cutting down and the plan is to quit. They just haven't quite said when, and it could be in 20 years for all one knows. Now, I think a benefit that we perhaps haven't focused enough on in our logical and rational arguments with patients about stopping smoking, and we know logical and rational doesn't always work terribly well, nevertheless it's a starting point, is the change in mental health after smoking cessation. So I think this came mainly from Bristol. So this is looking at psychological quality of life and positive affect. And this is a forest plot, so these are the means in the various studies put into the meta-analysis. These two are the confidence intervals, those long lines, and here we have the summation from the meta-analysis. So on this side is the findings which favour smokers, and on this side is the finding which favours quitters. So what we can see is there does seem to be a significant benefit in psychological quality of life and in positive affect from quitting smoking, although perhaps not that many smokers, but enough to make that another point to give to patients. You will feel better and you will feel healthier. And if you have anxiety and or depression, the chances are that those conditions will improve when you're able to quit smoking. Now, the Eagle study was much anticipated, and I hope you can see enough to get an impression at least. So they compared people with psychiatric disorders against controls, double-blind, randomized, placebo-controlled. So amazingly, they had placebo varenicline, they had placebo bupropion, Zyban, Champix Zyban, and placebo nicotine patches. And depending where you were randomized, you had either all three as a placebo, in which case you were control, or you had one active and the other two as placebo. And so in the non-psychiatric population, we can see almost 40% success rate at 9 to 12 weeks, compared with at weeks 9 to 24, slightly falling off 25%. Compare that with the psychiatric disorder population, a lower rate of success from varenicline, but the same sort of pattern. So bupropion on its own, Zyban, compares favorably with nicotine patches. We know that patches on their own really should be augmented with a second form of quick-acting nicotine replacement, which would, from other studies, take them up to the success of Champix. So combined overall, we get a sort of picture in the middle. And so it really shows that in those with a mental health psychiatric disorder, there's still the wish to quit. There is still the same pattern of performance of the medications. It's just harder for these patients to quit, so they probably need more support. The other question that this study was asking was there any increase in psychiatric illness or serious adverse events from the anti-smoking regimes? There was no significant difference in the rates of psychosis, suicidality, or mental health symptoms between the four groups. What they did show was that varenicline caused nausea, which we know, bupropion causes insomnia, which we know, and that nicotine patches can lead to more bad dreams. So those effects were seen, which is a nice way of sort of validating the overall study. Now, there's been a huge battle across the Atlantic between the US and the UK about electronic nicotine delivery systems or electronic cigarettes. So many people were scandalized by a report that came out in the UK about 6 months ago saying that electronic cigarettes are 95% safer than smoking tobacco. And what they may offer is a revolution in choice for nicotine products. So John Britton in London is at the Centre for Tobacco and Alcohol Studies, and he's one of the kind of lead authors in this area. What's been seen in the UK, I don't think so much in Australia, and our use of e-cigarettes has been kept quite limited because you can only get them from overseas for personal use. They're not sold in this country, and the nicotine products won't be sold. In the UK, there has been a decline in quitting over the last 3 or 4 years, which seems to coincide with wide availability of e-cigarettes. And I was in the UK in November 2014, and I was amazed in shopping centres how these devices were being represented as you know, along with attractive ladies wearing scant clothing. It was the way to be successful, was to buy an e-cigarette. Their claim, John Britton's claim, is that those who use e-cigarettes have a 50% greater success of quitting compared with over-the-counter nicotine replacement. So that's his kind of opening gambit. We know that nicotine causes you to smoke. It's the smoke which is going to kill you. So nicotine use on its own is relatively safe. Accessing quitline is still important. That will 2 to 3-fold increase your chances of success. And there's a EU directive coming along soon which will require nicotine concentration and content in all e-cigarette materials, in any tobacco products, to be labelled. So that may have an effect of cutting out some of the smaller producers because they may not have the infrastructure to achieve compliance, which could leave it open for big producers such as British American Tobacco, which says it's now a harm reduction focused company, to take over. So tobacco may be reborn in e-cigarette land, unfortunately. Interesting study from 2014 about plain packaging. Laneways in Melbourne with outdoor cafes where smoking was permitted because you weren't indoors, and they looked at how people kept their packs of cigarettes. So they did a pre and post, and they showed that after the plain packaging came in, the likelihood of you displaying your pack for everyone to see went down, and smoking went down as well. And when you did have a pack on display, there was a change in orientation, so the face was down to hide the hideous health message. So unconsciously, perhaps, people were less likely to display their package. So one would infer from that that this change has really produced a change in behaviour, and it's going to mean that children are much less likely to take up smoking in the future because it doesn't look cool. So this is the front page of an enormous document from the US deeming tobacco products to be subject to the Federal Food, Drug and Cosmetic Act. So that means any tobacco product, anything containing nicotine, is now going to be regulated by the FDA. So that's a huge step to take. The BMJ has been overflowing with this sort of stuff. Here we are, US to regulate all tobacco products, including e-cigarettes and hookah tobacco. That's those water pipes that are very popular in social circles. Of course, the recent budget will cause a 50% tax rise in tobacco over 4 years. We know that there's very strong negative elasticity in tobacco products. 100% rise in cost leads to a 42% drop in consumption. So that's negative price elasticity of minus 0.42, which is a very powerful effect. The same sort of arguments have been used for minimum pricing of alcohol, that if you put a minimum price of 50 cents or $1 on each unit of alcohol, you will dissuade people from drinking with positive results for their health. And of course, the UK is now one of about 5 countries where action by the tobacco companies to protect their packs from plain packaging legislation has failed. So that's great news, we'd all agree. Now, cannabinoids for medical use. A very good review in JAMA points to the confusion in this whole area. There are 23 states in the US which have legalized medical marijuana, MM. And it's also legalized for recreational use in 3 states, though it's still an illicit substance federally. So if you're making huge sums of money, you can't put it in the bank because that's profiting from the proceeds of crime, as the federal law enforcement officers describe. So in this meta-analysis, they had 79 trials using 10 different preparations of cannabis. So it is a complete mess. 6,500 participants. The quality, very poor. Many studies dating from the 70s and 80s, before, drugs we take for granted these days, like ondansetron, became available. Moderate evidence of improvements in pain, odds ratio of 1.4. That's a placebo-controlled study. So on a 10-point scale, that's equivalent to dropping 0.46 compared with placebo. So pretty soft result. Much more in the way of side effects compared with placebo: dizziness, nausea, dry mouth, drowsiness, hallucinations. So I liked the title of this next paper, "Is the Hype of Medical Marijuana All Smoke and Mirrors?" So this was in a gastro journal where they'd had a review of cannabis products for therapeutic purposes. They're describing it as a social experiment with very limited data, comparing apples and pears. So THC vintage 1960 is a very different product from 2015 vintage. How do doctors prescribe this? I'd suggest you take 2 cones at night, madam. Is that really plausible? Do we really understand the harms from smoking cannabis? And I've just got a quote from one study that was published about the benefits of cannabis use in Crohn's disease, which, as you know, can be a long-term debilitating, painful disorder. So you showed that patients who smoked marijuana had a better quality of life, a better appetite, and a higher satisfaction with treatment as compared with placebo, without any objective markers of inflammation. So people are saying, it made me feel better, doctor, therefore I should be able to use it. And I just wonder about that myself, whether doctors should be the gatekeepers for medicinal marijuana, or whether we shouldn't just throw the baby out with the bathwater and allow recreational use and anyone who chooses. So, summary: brain disease or not? It's really the wrong question to be asking, isn't it? This is a complex, multifactorial process that leads to substance use disorders. We've described harms from alcohol. Increasingly, the oldies are becoming vulnerable, as also we see in emergency departments around the world. Big tobacco, now big alcohol is sharing the limelight. Benefits of quitting on mental health. I think that's something you really need to focus on with our patients. Long-acting buprenorphine, it's coming in some shape or form. I don't think we're quite ready for it. And medicinal marijuana, another furphy. Thanks very much indeed.
Well, thank you, Jeremy. How many hours of reading have you just saved us? That's incalculable. Any questions from the floor for Jeremy? I don't know which topic you'd choose, but yes.
Oh, Jim.
Jeremy, I wonder if we did the same questionnaire for medicinal alcohol. Would people go, oh, in the short term, doctor, it's made me feel better at night?
Yes, I mean, I'm not sure whether alcohol improves sleep, but if you get drunk enough, you don't remember. So, yes, I think that's a very good point. Of course, if you give it to enough patients, you'll have some with the adverse effects, including hallucinations and so forth. So it's a risky strategy. And there's lots of blogs about people turning up in emergency in the US off their faces, driving their cars off their faces, which is a federal offence and can lead to lengthy terms of imprisonment. So I think that phrase, social experiment, is the correct one. And it seems to be that if you have a large enough proportion of your population in a state, then you can help get legislation up through your state legislature. And that's what's been happening. And it hasn't happened at a federal level, probably because big cannabis isn't big enough yet to bribe all the senators and congressmen. But that'll come, don't worry. Although it'll be all be in cash in brown envelopes because they can't write checks because they'd be in jail.
Any other questions?
Jeremy, I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts on the increasing cost of tobacco leading to it being on the black market again and the effect that that might have.
Yes, well, a patient only on Monday said, oh yeah, I don't have to pay much for it. I said, oh really? Yeah, chop chop. So challenges that tobacco companies try and wave in front of legislators, because tobacco companies actually facilitate smuggling of their products. It's one way for brand recognition and so forth. So it's suggested that Chop Chop is really not very safe because it hasn't been processed properly. So one thing we can be sure about is tobacco companies do process their products very well. Only 90% of the tobacco content of a cigarette is actually natural. The 10% is the additives, the glue, and the other materials that go out to make a slow-burning, fast-acting, nicotine-based laced product. So sure, I think that's certainly a risk. However, the suggestion that it's a tax on the poor, I think, ignores this price elasticity effect, that as the price goes up, more and more people decide to quit. And all this controversy between our two esteemed political parties about the revenue to be raised by tax on cigarettes being increased, it's all based on assumptions and models, and we probably don't really know. And as anyone I've said to, are you going to pay $40 a packet for your cigarettes? As anyone I've said that to has said, no, not on your life. Now, of course, it's happening in increments, and so if you go from 25 to 30 to 35 to 40, then perhaps you do end up paying $40 per pack. Many fewer people will, I think, and particularly children will find it totally out of reach for their limited budget.
We weren't to recommend e-cigarettes through our department. Is there moves to change that?
I don't think so. I think it's too fraught a battle. I think the UK, which, to give them credit, maybe they've got a much more harm reduction framework, and indeed the College of Physicians has produced several weighty terms which are very good to read about harm reduction and tobacco products. So I think it's back to this old abstinence model, AA, just say no, Nancy Reagan, that whole stuff. The US has this very binary view, either you're using it or you're not. Abstinence is what's required.
I'm talking about here in Queensland for us as practitioners.
Yes.
Should we be recommending e-cigarettes because it goes against the directive that came out?
Yes, so I don't think we've got enough clear evidence to recommend them myself. My personal view is that they seem to promote nicotine usage, and that often people end up using both in parallel. Now, some would say that that is lessening their exposure to smoke, which is going to kill them. We know that data on people cutting down, the health benefits of that are very, very limited. And so unless you're cutting down to quit, you're not going to get much out of smoking a few less cigarettes each day. It's very interesting using the smokalizer in clinic, because you get a result from someone when they're smoking 25 cigarettes a day. You kind of show them the damage, etc. They come back 3 months later and they're smoking 15 a day. You do their smokalizer reading, and as likely as not, it's actually gone up. So this is the idea of the elastic cigarette, that people smoke according to their brain's nicotine requirement, not according to the nicotine content of the cigarette. So if it's a weaker cigarette or they're smoking fewer of them, then they just smoke them a lot harder.
Any other questions? Any online? We've got one more online.
We have no technical problems, is that right?
No technical problems
So
today.
congratulations, gentlemen, Ben and
Thank you.
Jeff.
Can a difference be made between smoking tobacco being a behavioural problem and a nicotine addiction, and thus different approaches to treatment approaches or mix of all therapeutic measures? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I think there's some sense in that. So there are cues that every smoker will recognise after a meal, having that first cup of coffee in the morning. That's often when you have a cigarette, or it might be warm water, or as someone said to me on Monday, yes, I have a glass of warm water and a cigarette, because they don't drink tea or coffee. So those cues are part of the recognition and extinction process. So often people smoke in the car. You talk to tradies and they go to a job, they get in their car, and that's when they light up. So one of the steps to supporting them to quit is to reduce their cravings by giving them enough nicotine. Another is to get rid of the cues, so that you no longer have that coffee first thing in the morning, you have something different. You don't smoke in the car, you don't smoke in the house. After a meal, you go for a walk instead of going out for a cigarette. Those sorts of approaches certainly have an evidence to support them. So behaviour intertwined with chemical dependence.
I think we've run out of time. Join me again in thanking Dr. Jeremy Hayllar for that fascinating overview of all of that research. Next week is our last seminar.